And I want to start by just kind of talking through a couple of like the foundational elements that are part of self practice, or if you're here because you're a teacher and you want to take this to other people, same thing, just part of like building a sequence in general. So we'll start on the note of self practice as a whole. And there are some basic things that can be helpful far before you even step onto your mat. And I know a lot of times we think of it as like, oh gosh, well, as soon as I step on my mat, I don't know what to do. And these are just some things that I've found helpful throughout the years and that maybe could be helpful to you guys as well. And so, one thing would be to consider your actual space. Like, is there an area that you can keep a mat laid out? That can be really helpful. I used to have mine laid out right in front of my couch. I had a small living room. I didn't really have a place. Like now, I'm lucky I have this room that I can just dedicate to yoga. But when I started self practice, it was a mat laid out. It was actually right in front of the couch. And so it'd be like my feet would be on the mat if I was sitting on the couch. But it was a good reminder. Every time I would see that, I could just be like, oh, yeah, I should practice today. And that's one less thing to do is to roll out the mat. So little things like that can be helpful if you're trying to build like a home practice. Um, Additional things, and this is, both in regards to self practice as well as a teacher, like thinking, okay, I want to develop some new content for my students. Often that content needs to be like from a place of experience in order for it to be very rich, as compared to just kind of thinking like, okay, what is something like if I Google sequence, yoga sequence or whatever, and like write down a couple things other people have done, it might be more awkward to teach, and it might also not flow in the way that you necessarily want it to. And so when you actually get on your mat, it can be really helpful to set yourself up to just want to move. And so I find for me, things like I always have like Palo Santo nearby, and that smell I'll light right before I do a self practice, and it kind of gets me in that zone. It's a subtle thing, but it can be helpful. And good music. And so there are a few playlists that I plan to send out when I send the recording of this workshop. But having a playlist that just makes you kind of want to groove can be helpful, because then you stop thinking so much about like, okay, what should I physically do next? And you can kind of just let your body take the lead there. So that's just one thing to consider. The other thing would be to consider time. Weekend mornings for me have been a godsend because I don't have to think like I have to fit it exactly in this parameter. It's kind of like, okay, maybe it takes 5 minutes, maybe it takes 40 minutes, but it doesn't matter either way. And so if you're really trying to develop a sequence, whether again for yourself or for others, that could be another way to set yourself up for success, is to just schedule it into your weekend or open block of time that you don't have to like be done by a certain time or start at a certain time, and you can just like be present for it. That can be really helpful. Any questions, concerns, comments, ideas before we start looking at the actual resource? Okay. If at any point you have anything, let me know. So I wanted to go over this before we start actually getting on our mats and potentially experimenting with it. So the yoga self-practice menu is something I developed. I've been trying to think of a way to share how I sequence for years. My very first teaching opportunity was in Lander, where a couple of you currently live. I was invited to teach a yoga self-practice workshop, and I wasn't a yoga teacher at the time or anything. I just like showed up and taught this thing. And I was like, that didn't go how I wanted it to. And I've for years thought like, how do I actually teach this in an accessible way? And this is what I came up with. So if you open this up, the first page, first of all, there's a QR code you can scan to a YouTube video. That's just me talking through this resource. So if at any point you need I think it's like a 12 or 15-minute video refresher, it's there. And it's essentially set up as a menu with like course 1, course 2, course 3, course 4. Course 1 is the warm-up. So like all parts of the practice, this can be fast or slow, it can be repeated, it could not. Oftentimes, if we're like, gosh, I want to have a longer practice and I don't know what to do, like repetition can be fabulous. That's, the foundation of vinyasa classes. Things we can think about here that our body is really ready for. And this whole menu, guys, is set up anatomically. So it's the ranges of motion that are easier in the body that come first. And then we progress into ranges of motion that take a little more warmth. And so when we think about a warm up, we can think about moving the spine from front to back and from side to side. We can also think about finding some twists in the warm up. Those can be really nice, accessible movements. And then ultimately, we also want some full body heat building. That's where you often see things like sun salutations at the start of a practice. It's where, the way I phrase it in here, get from the back of your mat to the front of your mat, from the front to the back, go from being on the mat to standing, and allow yourself to just be playful in those movements. That can be a great place to warm up. And we're going to take a moment to play with that here in a second. I just want to do a brief overview of the rest. And then the second course, this is the sagittal set. And so when we think about the sagittal plane, it's like if picture like a wall dividing my body in half, left and right sides. And if that wall projects out this way and I move along that plane, then it's movements like lifting my leg or kicking my leg back, bringing my arms forward or backward, bringing my torso forward or backward. Those are all sagittal movements. And they're a little bit easier in our joints. So for the leg to go front or back, even just given how we walk, it's a lot easier than for the leg to go side to side, which uses smaller muscle groups and muscles that aren't as traditionally utilized just in our day-to-day movements. So that's why we start with the sagittal set. And you'll see that what I've done here is I've color coded. The blue shapes are ones that you can do a little bit more cold. So your body doesn't need to be as warm. I should just continue modeling this. Your body doesn't need to be as warm. For example, to flex my right hip, I can do this without having any warmth. I'm not overstretching anything. I can do it cold and it's probably not going to be as high as if I'm warm, but it's still very accessible. If I start to get lower to the mat, that typically means that gravity is deepening the shape for me. And so if I try to do this pose earlier in class, that feels a lot more intense to me, even though it's the same range of motion, I'm just closer. Now, if I try to go into full splits, I'm not warmed up right now. You can tell my body is nope, that's not happening. And so when you think of what shapes to start with, typically shapes that require less heat, and another way to think of it is typically they're higher up from the mat, are often going to be safer for your body. And then we move into the counter. So we think of flexing, and then we can also think of extending. And so it's we work something on the front of the body, and then we stretch it. And those are complementary. They're in the same plane of motion, but it really nicely fits to have them come after each other. And I'll show you how that looks in regards to actually moving on the mat here in a moment. And then oftentimes we are aware of what we're doing with our legs, but we maybe leave out the arms. And so you'll see I've included arms and shoulders as well. So we can also think of that same range of motion, flexing through the arms and then extending through the arms. All right, and so again, color coded in the same way. The second set is the transverse. And so the transverse set, whereas the sagittal, we thought of a plane dividing me in half left and right. Transverse is dividing in half front and back. So it's if a wall were extending out of my ears and shoulders and everything, and I have a front side and a back side. And so movements along that plane are often going to be opening from midline and crossing midline. That's where we think of things like our warriors, things like our archers, stuff like that. And then again, so if we move away from midline, then we cross toward midline. So that's when we find our abduction and our adduction. of both legs and shoulders. And then to conclude, we have our final set, which is often where you see things like external and internal rotation. It's where you see twists. It's where you're going to see back bends and stuff. Not to say those things aren't present throughout the class in earlier ways, but to say that it's more dedicated space to it, because like a deep back bend really requires full body engagement. We have to be pretty warm and prepared before we would go into something like a wheel pose or a camel pose or something. And so, yeah, that's kind of how we can think of using this menu. I do have a note at the back I want to go over before we actually start using it in real time here. This is meant to be a launching point. So I have pose examples here. This is not a comprehensive list by any means. And I think you'll discover that every once in a while you find your body in a shape and you're going to be like, oh, I don't even know if this has a name. I've never been coached into this or seen anyone do this. Just I kind of found my way into it because it felt good. So know that like the potential for poses is kind of infinite. Like there's no real bounds around that. Consider too that exploration is going to be far more helpful than having an expectation. So allowing yourself to just be curious on the mat is probably going to be more productive than, say, thinking like, oh, I want to do this, this, and this today. Like, okay, but what if you start to do the second item on your list and it doesn't feel good? Like being willing to revise in real time can be super helpful. If you're kind of at a loss of like, hey, what do I do next? Like, I think it's a really fun thing to try linking poses that don't really seem to have much in common. So for example, maybe you want to do like a standing balance and you also want to do a symmetrical squat shape. Okay, how do you get from one to the other? And like let that be its own form of flow. And then again, especially if you're thinking of building a self practice, 5 minutes a day is going to be far more impactful in building the habit than 1 hour once a week. Like just getting yourself used to showing up on your mat will make it a lot easier. I committed when I decided I wanted to start a self practice, I committed to showing up every day for a year, which I don't think I've ever been that disciplined about anything before or since. But I was disciplined in that at that one point in my life. And some days I literally get on my mat and like find a child's pose, and that would be what I do. Other days I would have like 3 poses that I did on one side, then on the other side, and maybe I'd repeat that. You know, like it was really, really short sometimes. And at the end of that year, there were times where I was staying on my mat for like an hour without any plan, without any like, I mean, this was before I was a yoga teacher or anything, without any like training of it. Just because if you develop the habit day by day, then you're kind of giving yourself that permission to see where it goes. So any questions, comments, concerns before we move into actually using this here in a minute? Okay. Like I'm talking a lot. I don't normally talk this much at a screen without moving. Okay, let's go ahead and if you're not interested in moving this morning, you can like totally opt to not do this and to just watch. But if you're interested in finding some movement, let's go ahead and have potentially your resource with you. You can always lay it flat at the top of your mat to where you can see course 1 and course 2 listed. And so we're going to start with the warm-up, which is course 1. And we're going to start by playing with the spine front to back. So we want to think of the spine getting to round and getting to like contract on the backside and to create space on the backside, which of course means contract on the front side and create space on the front side. So something like a cat-cow, you can take that same range of motion and do it for kneeling, looking up, and then rounding in. You can also do it from like a squat. You want to find spinal movement there, or even from a standing cat-cow, hands on knees. And so choose any of those options. Don't care at all what I'm doing. Maybe you experiment with a couple of them. You determine, it feels better if I'm closer to the mat or if I'm further from the mat. And then wherever you are, I want to keep experimenting with the spine, but we're going to level it up just a bit. So allow yourself to make a little more heat in this pose, and don't think about it too much. Just think, okay, what could add a little more heat? For me, in my standing version, letting my hands come off of my knees makes it a bit more active. Maybe in cat-cow on the mat, you hover your knees on the exhale. Maybe you decide to lower yourself down to your belly and find some lifting of the heart here without using the hands. Maybe that builds some heat for you. Let's go for about 3, 2, and 1. From here, we want to think of moving the spine side to side. You can absolutely change where your body is for that to happen. Or you can try to find it from the same place. So, for example, going from cat-cow, maybe I start to do the tail wag side to side, contracting through side body, expanding to the opposite side body. Maybe instead I come to kneeling and I do an arm reaching up overhead. And today we're going to play mostly with like feel free to oscillate here, essentially. Don't feel like you need to find stillness. You can absolutely find stillness, but sometimes if we're already moving, it's easier to keep moving. And so that can be a little thing you do for yourself too, is like, okay, I'm moving my spine side to side. What if I do it from a squat now? Right now, what if I stand up and find this? And wherever you are, we'll continue for 3, 2, 1. Go ahead and find some stillness. Maybe you take a breath. And we're going to find a twist now. So again, you can do that from wherever you are, or you can always think of changing your shape. Maybe I'm standing and I'm twisting and I want to bring it into a chair, or I want to lower down to kneeling. Maybe I want to bring my hands to the mat when I'm here. You can really experiment. If we're just focusing on a twist, okay, well, what if I do come down toward a bit of a cat-cow? And maybe you're like, holy crap, this is the first movement when somebody threads the needle under. So maybe you add that in. Maybe you find a moment of stillness, maybe you keep moving. Wherever you are, the invitation is to remain there for 3, 2, 1. All right, so you're probably already feeling some heat building. We're going to continue to build heat. So we've done some introductory movements. We want to start exaggerating our movements. So this is where we want to think of getting from the back of the mat to the front of the mat, or getting from being down low to being up high. So a really traditional form of that is where we start in a downward facing dog. Okay, this is often about the point in the class where somebody would bring us to a down dog. And then from here, you already know sun salutations, right? Where you bring one leg up and step it forward, or depending on the sun salutation style. You know, maybe both legs come through, maybe there's a half lift, maybe there's a chair, maybe there's a lift all the way up. And there's always that invitation to keep with any of the other movements we've already found. So we've already unlocked side bending. So maybe you find a side bend at the top of your mat, the top of your sun salutation. And then again, we go from standing to down low. This is often where a teacher will move through a vinyasa. So maybe you lower your knees, maybe you keep them lifted, but you can think about lowering toward the mat. Maybe you find a little back bend since you've already been experimenting with that. Maybe you find your way back to a down dog. And that's really handy because, especially if you stepped one foot forward, then just to balance out, which of course is something we always try to do, just through the nature of that, it's like, well, I better do one of those again. Just step my other foot forward first. And we get from the back of the mat to the front. We're down low when we come up high. And then we think, okay, I did a side bend on the last time I was here, so maybe I'll do a side bend again. Or if you did a side bend both directions, then you could do something else. Maybe you find a little bit of a heart opener, reaching the heart toward the ceiling. And then again, front of the mat to the back this time. Going from higher to lower. And we'll all meet in a downward facing dog. If you're still moving and finding your way around, that's perfect. Don't worry about it. We're going to be here for just a couple breaths. And so down dog, from the sequencing end of things, is a great place if you're the one creating the sequence, because you can come here and people expect to be here for a moment. So as a teacher, you're like, okay, what comes next? People are waiting in a down dog, taking a few breaths. That's perfect. You get time to collect your thoughts. If you are at home in your self-practice, then this is a place to come to think, okay, let me remember what I just did. Do I need to repeat it on the other side? Am I currently balanced out? So we are currently balanced out. And if we look at our menu, we see that we're to course 2, the sagittal set. So we're going to start moving the legs in a way that flexes on the front side and then opens on the front side. And we're going to start with some of those more accessible ones. So I want you to look at your document and choose one of the blue poses that you feel is maybe where you want to go next. And truly feel free to not follow me at all here. I'm just going to model one potential option. But essentially, you'll decide, okay, what leg am I going to start with? Maybe my right. And then figure out how to get into whatever shape you chose. Setting up in whatever way that looks like. So one potential flexion option is a high lunge. It's one that's pretty accessible early on, so that's why I chose that. But if you wanted to do the standing leg lift, you could always either step the left foot forward or hop the right foot back and then lift through that leg. Right? But either way, you're finding some flexion on the right hip. Now I want you to notice, I have a warrior 3 listed there. If we're focusing on the right leg, ask yourself, okay, what does that mean? If I'm flexing on the front side of the right leg, which leg is lifted in a warrior 3? It's going to be your left one. Okay, so if I'm flexing through my right hip and I decide I want to take it into a warrior 3, focusing on that flexing range of motion, that means my left leg is lifted. All right, because I'm really focusing on the flexion of the right leg. Now, wherever you are, let's make a quick transition, not necessarily quick, into one of the red forms. So the red forms are typically a little more passive, meaning that gravity deepens them, meaning that we typically want a little bit of warmth. So if we've already done one of the more active variations, look at the red forms and choose one of those to go into. Right, so maybe you choose Malasana squat, some passive flexion. Maybe you choose your pyramid pose. But you'll notice that these red poses maybe feel more like a stretching version of this range of motion, whereas the blue ones maybe feel like a strengthening version of this range of motion. And they basically all require both strength and flexibility. So just know that, that there's always a little bit of both going on. But this one probably uses gravity a bit more, probably has a little bit more flexibility going on, any of the red shapes. All right, so now we've done two. We've done a more active and a more passive flexion for our right leg. So from here, we look toward the extension, and the extension shapes are going to be the opposite but complementary range. So one way to do it would be to find a way to switch the legs. All right, maybe you do a hop switch. Maybe that's something you're interested in. Maybe you want to find a vinyasa and then step the left foot forward. But a really nice, simple way to do it, in a way that if you've practiced with me, you see me do it all the time, is just to crawl the hands to the other side of the mat. So now we're facing the back edge of the mat, which first of all, challenges our mental component of yoga because we have a different thing we're looking at. If we're in a class, all of a sudden, if I was in the front of the room, now I'm in the back of the room and vice versa, it can be really kind of handy in that way to keep us mentally engaged in the class. But also now my right leg is back. And that's handy because if I look at the shapes involved, they're all stretching through the front side of that hip, meaning that that leg needs to be back. So maybe I find one of the blue shapes here. Maybe I do Uparaga, my upward bird, where I'm really actively lifting that knee, opening through the front side of that hip. Maybe I choose something else. You'll notice like I can still do a high lunge here. I did a high lunge for flexion, but it was because my right leg was forward. So my point of focus in that form was on the front leg. My point of focus in the form now is on the back leg and opening through the back hip. That's the same as Warrior 3. If I want to do a Warrior 3 for extension as the focus, whereas a Warrior 3 for flexion as the focus, my right leg had to be forward. Well, now I want to open through that hip. So now my right leg would be back as I do it. And that same shape has a different focus. So it's, keeping me honest about what range of motion I'm working on. And whatever you've chosen, go ahead and look toward one of the red forms and find it. So a low lunge, for example, brings a little more gravity into play, where when I was doing my standing upward bird with my leg bent, knee lifting, I was really feeling the fight against gravity. It felt very strengthening. Now that I'm here in a low lunge, it's that same range of motion. I still feel opening through the front side of my hip. And I'm a little bit deeper, right? It's a little bit more passive. So I feel a little stretchier here. Wherever you found yourself, stay there for just another breath. This is the point where we think, okay, we've already done a few different things on this side. Do we want to keep adding, or are we going to forget what we did when we try to do it on the other side? So this is where we might end the set, okay? We did an active then passive flexion, an active then passive extension. So to get back to the front of the mat, to start this all over and do it on the other side, we have options. Option 1 is to go out the same way we came in. So we'd crawl the hands back to the right foot at the front edge of the mat, step it back, downward facing dog. Option 2 is going to be to ask ourselves, is there some other way that maybe incorporates the same ranges of motion, but maybe a different part of my body? So I'm noticing I've done a lot with my legs, but not with my arms yet. So maybe I step back to a downward facing dog at the back edge of my mat. And you guys have seen me do this frequently. I'm focusing on flexion in my right shoulder, right? I've been all about my right side so far. So if I want to get to the front edge of my mat, I know I can do that and work that right shoulder if I just bring my left hand back. Right here, my right arm is being worked. I have my fingers tented outside of my left foot. Now, if I bring my left hand to my left thigh, I can bend into my knees and drop my sit bones. So now, really conveniently, I'm already extending through my shoulder. So I just flexed it. Now I get to extend it by lifting through my heart. And in this way, I'm like, okay, so I got flexion and extension in my shoulder too. Sweet. Absolutely don't need to make the set longer by doing that, but it's an option. All right, and then from here, I would again find my way to the front edge of the mat and step it back, downward facing dog, just how we started the other side. So often this is where you have an invitation to find a vinyasa, maybe coming forward, lowering halfway or all the way, finding a back bend, finding your way up and back to a down dog. And then you have this moment again where you can think like, what the crap did I just do on that other side? And you know how it starts, right? Because you were focusing on the right leg. So you at least know to start, okay, I have to get my left leg forward. So pretty simple, left leg comes forward. And maybe you look down at your resource at the menu and you see one of those stick figures, you're like, oh yeah, that's what I did. And so then you can come up, finding whatever blue shape you started with. So the really nice thing about this method is that it has breadcrumbs, right? It's got a little bit Hansel and Gretel style that we think, okay, I started with my right leg, so I'll start with my left leg. And then we know it's a flexion range of motion. And even if you forget the exact pose, this is my favorite part of it, even if you forget the exact pose, if you're doing flexion on this side, like you're still going to be very balanced out, even if you do a different pose. So maybe I think, oh gosh, that's right, I stepped back and I lifted my left leg. But if I'd forgotten that part, like, that's fine. I was still in a lunge with my left leg forward. I was still getting that same range of motion. And then we know we found a more passive version. So again, maybe you glance down at your resource and you realize, oh yeah, I found a pyramid, or I found a half split. Maybe you found yogi squat. But again, a breadcrumb. You did an active version and then you did a more passive version. Something where gravity deepened the shape for you. And so you get a couple breaths here. Feeling it on your second side. And then you have to think here. You're like, okay, I did my active, I did my passive. Where am I headed next? Well, we're headed to the complementary shape. So right now, the front side of my hip is contracted, and it probably feels like it once stretched, right? Like that is my favorite part about the sequencing. I keep saying favorite part. I have a lot of favorite parts. That's one of my favorite parts about this method is sequencing, is that it feels very intuitive. So when I'm teaching or when I'm practicing, if I just like listen to my body, I'm like, oh yeah, my hip feels like it's been in this range of motion for a bit. It kind of wants to stretch. And how would I stretch it? Well, I can crawl to the back edge of my mat, and all of a sudden, that hip is being stretched again. And it probably feels good in your body. And maybe that's not true, but I think the more that you practice this method, you'll you'll feel that. You'll be like, okay, I've done this for a while now. How do I kind of counter what I just did? All right. And so from here, I remember that I found an upward bird for my active. You maybe found a warrior 3. You maybe found your high lunge. I kind of went through a bunch of stuff as I was demoing, so try to do that again on this side. And then we know we moved to a more passive version. So something where gravity aids us, it maybe feels like less muscle engagement in the body sometimes during the passive variations. I know I went into a low lunge and let gravity do the work. And again, every time you're in a shape, the invitation is to be present for it, right? Like, we don't need to be thinking about, okay, what comes next? Although, especially at the start, that can be handy. And especially as a teacher, it can be really helpful to consider, okay, while my students are in this shape, while I'm potentially in the shape with them, I'm personally an advocate of doing flows with your students so then you have a little bit more to talk about of like the experience of it, because you're right there experiencing it with them. It's a shared authentic experience of that moment. So maybe while you're here, you're thinking, okay, what did I do? Okay, so I just did my active and my passive extension. I think I just need to get back to the front of the mat. And you just have to remember how you did that. So there's a chance that you lifted your left knee and you came out the way you went in by crawling the hands. There's also the chance that you added in that shoulder flexion. So you found a down dog facing the back of the mat. And then again, we're working the left side right now. So my left hand is going to stay planted. And I'm going to make it more intense by dragging my right fingertips back, tenting them near my right foot. So I feel the strength happening in my left shoulder. And then from here, I just need to find a way to like move through under my right armpit. So I'm gonna get the hand out of the way, grab onto my thigh, soften my knees and pivot on my feet. And I just flex through my shoulder. So now I get to extend through it. I get to stretch it out a little bit. And then from here, let's rock up to a seat. So traditionally, you'd probably find another vinyasa or do something like that. But one thing to think about is that we just finished a whole nother set. All right, and so if you wanted to add in more, you could for that set. For example, if you look at the arm and shoulder extension, if I'm already seated, it'd be a great place for me to find something like a reverse tabletop, or maybe even a reverse plank. And so maybe I, look down and I see that and I'm like, yeah, I have time or interest in that. I'll give it a shot. All right, but maybe I'm like, I kind of want to reset between my courses. So this is where we'll flip over the menu if you have it printed, or you can scroll to the next page if you have it digital. And we know that the transverse set is coming. This is often a longer set in classes, again, because we don't use those quite as much, those ranges of motion, and we sometimes need a little bit more. Also, there's just so much variety, so many things we can choose from, and our bodies are warm enough by this point that we continue to unlock more things that we can access, which is really what it comes down to, is all of a sudden, as I'm thinking through these things, I just have more options. At the start of class, like pretty limited because my body is pretty cool. All right, so thinking about where we're headed, we know we're going to start moving away from midline and toward midline. We also know that we can continue to add in things like back bends. We can continue to work the arms. So if you look down towards arms and shoulders, you'll see that there are stars next to some things as a reminder that those can be used in a wide variety of shapes. So for example, cactus arms, I can use that in a lot of different forms and think about, okay, what's going on with my legs, but maybe also, let's add in the arms for a minute. So we are going to find our way into a downward facing dog. Again, take your method in getting there. Maybe you come to your feet first and then go back. Maybe you cross over the ankles and go back. There's a lot of different options, and those are part of the flow as well. So be there on purpose. And then find your way into your down dog. And we just did left side sagittal set. So we're gonna start by getting the right leg forward. So this time, as you bring the right leg up, find something along the way with it. So maybe you draw knee toward nose, maybe you open the leg up, maybe you draw knee toward elbow, but just play with getting that right foot forward by finding something along the way. All right, and once that right leg is forward, look toward the resource and decide, okay, what do I want to do? Do I want to find a tree pose? Do I want to find a warrior? Do I want to find an archer? For me right now, I'm kind of liking the idea of finding an archer, which means I'll have to open up to the long edge of my mat and angle my toes out. And I'm again focusing on the right foot, so it's the right knee that I'm bending into as I find this archer form. If you were doing warrior 2, it would be the right knee forward still. Again, we're just starting with one of the more active ones. And again, you can think about what your arms are doing. Archer pose is easy because your arms are already, there's something going on, but it could be something else. I can instead try to bind my hands in the center of my shoulder blades. Or I could cross my arms in front of me in my eagle arms. And it doesn't need to be the traditional. You can do that in warrior as well. Stay here for one more breath. And then think, okay, I want to get a little more passive here. What is a passive option? Well, one passive option is going to be for me to come into a side angle, right? That gives gravity a little bit more work here, maybe deepen sensation. Another option is going to be to find Skandasana at the back edge of my mat, because that's what allows my inner right thigh to more passively stretch. And so maybe you find a choice there. You'll notice I don't even have, it's crazy because I do it all the time, but oh yeah, I do have Skandasana on there. Didn't see it for a second. I was like, weird, that was an oversight. But yeah, because I'm focusing on the right leg, I have to know, do I bend into the right leg? Well, no, I don't really feel it in the leg I bend into. And so you can experiment. Which leg do I bend into again here? Well, where are you feeling sensation? And we want to really target the right leg right now. So I'll make the adjustment to where I feel the sensation in my right leg. All right, now from here, there's also an opportunity to find something symmetrical. So that could be a wide-legged forward fold. That could be a goddess squat or a yogi squat, which is a little bit narrower and hips are low to the ground. And maybe while you're here, wherever here is, you consider, are there any goals you have for this practice? So sometimes we have poses that we're projecting or working on, and we want to work them in. So for example, maybe I'm like, oh, I really want to work on getting that bind in my side angle pose. So maybe I allow myself a chance to do whatever will help me get that bind. Okay, so I've opened my legs a bit, and now maybe I go back to that side angle and I find the bind. Maybe I've really been working on a headstand. And so even though I'm working on, opening through my hips right now, I can think, this is a great place to maybe try a headstand. So maybe I allow myself or my students to go upside down. And this is where in a class I might cue, okay, if you go upside down, keep your legs wide, because remember, we're working on opening side to side. So that my students are really aware that, yeah, they can be upside down, but we're still working that range of motion. And wherever you are, we're going to continue to crawl the hands all the way to the back edge of the mat. All right, so if you have to make any transitions to make that happen, I just want to show you what's a really handy way to transition here. So we've already had some vinyasas, traditional vinyasas, belly down. We're going to step the left foot back and set up in a plank. Now you could do a vinyasa and bring a leg forward and so on, but a really handy way to vinyasa here is to come into a side plank. Maybe the right foot steps in front, maybe the hips, knees are lowered and we're in a side plank from there. There's a lot of different options, but something that's kind of fun here is to bring the right foot to step toward the left. All right, and so from there, we plant the foot and continue circling around, and all of a sudden we're back at the front edge of the mat. We've spun an entire circle to the left, working just the right side of the body. Right, so it's kind of like, holy crap, suddenly this is a super interesting yoga flow. And it was all pretty logical, and like there's lots of breadcrumbs to follow back. So now I look down at my menu, and I see that abduction is next. And so for myself, I'm like, oh, okay, I just moved away from center line with my legs. Now I want to go across center line. So again, I could choose any of those forms. Even the red ones we're really ready for at this point because we're pretty warm. But again, I'm working my right leg. And so let's say I want to do this standing cross-legged. And I'm like, gosh, I don't know what leg I have forward. Well, I could just say, I'm working on the right leg, so have my right leg forward. Maybe I get here and I'm like, I feel this more in my left leg though. Well, okay then, switch it up. That's totally fine. It's all about just experimenting. Being where you are on purpose is the way I like to think of it. Like, try something, observe the sensation, and then you can always make an adjustment. And if you're teaching people and you're like, left leg forward, and then you're like, wait, never mind, right leg forward, they don't care. Like, it's all part of it. And you can always do left leg forward, and maybe you as the teacher realize like, oh crap, this isn't what I meant. And you're like, all right, we're just meeting this pose. And now out of it, cross right leg forward, and we're actually going to stay here for a moment. Right? So a really subtle way to recognize like, whoops, that's not the side I want, but make it intentional. All right. Wherever you are, we need to make our way back to a downward facing dog because that's how we entered this side. So we have a lot of options. This is where maybe you're like, oh, I haven't done an arm balance yet. Maybe I want a crow pose. Maybe since we're working side to side, you want to try a side crow and then make your way back. Ultimately, it's totally up to you. Every time you finish a set, especially once you've done left and right, it's kind of helpful to keep those fairly close to each other so you don't forget what you just did. But even between sides, you can do anything. I mean, either do it on one side and remember to do it again on the other side, or keep it symmetrical and you don't even have to remember. So for example, if I do a crow pose here, like that's a symmetrical shape. I do not need to come back and do a crow pose after side two. Like that's fine. Maybe I realize, I haven't done a standing forward fold yet, and that sounds really nice. So, okay, find that. Maybe you want to go back and give your shoulders some love because you just did that bind. And you think, okay, I'm going to go ahead and melt my torso down in a puppy pose. All right, I see a hand. Yeah, Tony, do you have a question?
I have a question, sorry. So do you typically, like when you're going through class, do you always start with one side and continue with that, like one side is the start, or because that's where I get messed up because I start with one side and then I flick to another side. So what is your method for that sort of thing?
Yes, okay, great question. I typically choose one side and stay with it. So yeah, I'll do for each set, that is. So like if I'm gonna start with my right side for the whole class, every time I start a new set, I'll start with my right side, just so that am alternating, and that, for example, if I started with my right side, but then on the next set I started with my left side, then my left side would be getting worked twice right in a row. And I like to just kind of break it up a little bit.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, good to know. Sorry, I just had to ask because I would have forgotten if I didn't ask.
No, I'm so glad you asked. I really want this to be super open. So thank you for asking that. That's a great question. Yeah, so that also helps it be easier for you as the teacher. And it doesn't matter what side it is. Like most teachers start with the right side. One of my teachers always starts with left because typically there's more cueing involved on the first side. And then the second time you go through it, your students are like, oh yeah, we've been here. And so you spend sometimes a little bit less time on that side, even though we try to make it even. And so one of my teachers only starts with the left side because she feels that side gets more neglected. So totally up to you how you want to do it. But at the start of each class, just make sure that you are clear with yourself, essentially. All right, and we're gonna go ahead and do that same set on the other side. So again, we lifted the left, well, we lifted the right, but now we're going to the left. We lifted that leg up and we found something. We'd moved that leg in some way. Found one little touch point or something before stepping it forward. And then once we found it, we decided which of the blue forms do we want to find? And this is where I decided on archer, but also like a warrior 2 would be good. You know, you could always do a more active variation where you're on your hands and knees, you get fire hydrant, or maybe just a standing leg lift out to the side, right? If you did a leg lift at the start, maybe you're like, oh, I'm really liking how active that is. Let's experiment with it out to the side, and holy crap, that's so hard. And you know, like you can style a class in that way by choosing kind of similar forms in each range of motion. And again, we talked about like experimenting with hands too. What other things could my hands be doing while I'm here? And maybe that makes it interesting. Like instead of warrior 2 arms out to the sides, what if I did warrior 2 with eagle arms? And I still had my students look over their left shoulders, or I, in my own self-practice, maybe found some neck stretches here, like so many options. And then we looked down and we chose one of the red forms. So a little bit more passive variation. An invitation to open through the left thigh with a little less effort, maybe. A little less strength is involved. And again, it can be a form of exploration. You might try a couple different things. This is where I went back and forth in my Skandasana to decide, where do I feel it in my left leg? Oh, okay, I feel it in my left leg when I'm over here. So that's where I'll go ahead and set up. And then from this point, we needed to make it to the back of our mat. So this is where I talked about that funky form of a vinyasa. So a lot of times teachers have you open to the side and then instantly go back to the front. And personally for me, I find it a little harder to remember that as a teacher because everything suddenly becomes so similar in my mind. I'm like, we're always just going back to the front. Like, did I miss something? And I would have here. I did something symmetrical, so it was fine. But maybe another wide-legged forward fold, right? In this variation of sequencing I'm teaching, you can do little sets and make it vinyasa style, where you have like a 2-pose set, and then you add a 3rd pose the next time you do it on each side. And like, you don't need to do each course just once, but you can make a whole class where you do each course once. And because it's so diverse, there are a few poses that you would repeat, but maybe something like a wide-legged forward fold, you do get to repeat. Maybe you remember, oh yeah, some people went on their heads last time. Maybe you cue that again, or maybe you deepen. So maybe this is where you would have a frog pose. and send your hips back and like, okay, same range of motion, but it feels a little bit different. Whereas I feel wide-legged forward fold on my hamstrings, I feel this more on my inner thighs. So maybe that's something I want to offer myself or my students. And then we made our way to the back edge of the mat. So we've been working the left side. We've so far spun a circle to the right? And I want to continue that. I want to make a whole circle to the right. So I'm going to step back into a plank. And I'm going to have to think, okay, which leg would I have to step forward to have my circle continue to the right? If I step my right leg forward, well, my hands can't walk to the right, my leg's in the way. So I know the left leg is going to come forward. So I'm going to create space for it by coming into a right side plank. I'm going to look toward my hand and step my foot where it lands. It doesn't need to go anywhere near my hand for me to be able to continue crawling all the way back to the right foot at the front edge of the mat. And maybe as I arrive, I think, oh crap, what did I do? And that's where I look at my menu and I realize, oh yeah, the next range of motion is adduction, so crossing center line. And I happen to have chosen one of the forms that's shown here. I did that cross-legged shape. So I'll step my left foot forward and maybe I realize, oh crap, my right leg's in front. I'm working on my left leg. I don't feel anything in my left leg when my right leg's in front, so I make that adjustment until I feel sensation in my left leg. And there we have it. And that's my check. That's how I know that I'm staying balanced. Now, maybe I look down at my menu and I realize, okay, I did like some things with my arms, but I didn't really feel much of a stretch in them. This would be a great place to go down to hands and knees and look at these options and say, all right, actually, I think it would feel really nice for me to lay on my belly and maybe bring an arm out and find that abduction through one shoulder and then the other. And because I'm done with my set, like I'm at the very end of it, everything I do here, I'm just going to keep symmetrical. So I don't have to like remember to do it somehow later. So I did it for one arm, now I switch to the other side. And it's like almost a mini little set in and of itself, but it's still part of the same course. Like it's still these same ranges of motion that are in the transverse set, opening away from center line and crossing over center line. And again, I'm all balanced out now. So every time we're balanced out, there's an invitation to do something else. Maybe I want to come sit at the back edge of my mat and do some breath work. That could be really powerful right here. Maybe I want to repeat something I did. This is always a time where I'm like, oh yeah, we talked about binding, right? And I forgot to do that on the other side. So I'm already balanced out and it's a little out of order, but whatever. Like maybe I remember I forgot to bind on this side. So I guide myself into that here. And then I prepare for the final set. So the final set is external rotation, internal rotation. It's any finalizing back bends, anything that you've been building up heat for that you want to explore. So I like to think of it in rock climbing, we have this term called projecting. Like if you're projecting something, then you're kind of working on it when you can. Like if you're having a strong climbing day, especially you'd be like, okay, I'm gonna go over to that climb and try it today. And we can do that in yoga. Okay, so at the end of class, you're all warm and maybe there's something you want to try. And so I typically do my rotations first and then kind of end with those. So I look down and I see, okay, there's forms of figure 4 rotation. Again, all of the red forms by this point in class are probably pretty fair game. So I could do a traditional pigeon. Again, right leg forward because I'm starting with my right leg this whole class. But maybe a little less gravity intensive of one sounds better. And this is where it's really important as a teacher to be able to tell the people you're with, like, hey, there are options here, like doing a traditional pigeon pose, maybe that creates more pressure on your knee. So do it seated, and now all of a sudden the pressure on the knee is gone, and it's the same range of motion, the same benefit for your hip. And typically at this point in the practice, I will keep it all symmetrical. So if I do something here, I'm just going to release, maybe find some wiggles or movements, and then I'm going to do it on the other side. And some ranges of motion, guys, it's not like you need all of them in every class, in every practice. It's first of all impractical. And second of all, some of them don't feel maybe as nourishing all the time. So for example, rotation of the shoulders, I don't often do. I'll do this one, right? That's rotation of the shoulders. But I don't often sit here like this and find internal rotation through my arms with pressure on my knees. Like I do sometimes, sometimes that's a thing, but not often. The one I show you where the person's like laying down on their outer wrist and laying like that can feel so nice, but it's such a niche stretch that I don't do it very frequently. And I don't teach it to my students unless we've done some really intense shoulder stuff that feels really necessary to loosen in that way, because it is such a deep one that otherwise it could probably just feel unsupported in their bodies. All right, and so maybe I notice, I can lay on my back and do windshield wiper legs. And then, that's internal rotation of the hips in a more mild form. I could always do half hero where I tuck a foot under, tuck my tailbone and keep the off foot planted. And again, you might not know what you want or what feels good in your body until you explore. And I think that's really a cool part of self-practice and of teaching, is that you get the chance to just be like, well, I'll try this out and just see how it lands. And some things, depending on what's been in the entirety of the class, some ways of closing are going to feel better than others. If you've done a headstand, for example, and put weight on your neck, doing a supine twist at the end, like a spinal twist or shoulder stand, is going to feel so good. If you try to do a shoulder stand, like you haven't done that, it just might not feel quite as necessary. And so this is the point where then you ask yourself, like, okay, do I want to end with any back bends? Maybe I do a bridge pose or something. Maybe I do a wheel. One thing to consider is that if there are certain things you want to work toward in your sequence, then you can work them in all throughout. We did not do a lot of back bending in the sequence. If I wanted to, in the warm-up, I could have really emphasized the back bend by having like locust lifts early on. When we did flexion of the legs and we were in a high lunge, I could have had my students cactus their arms and lift their heart, right? And working a back bend in that way. Maybe when we did our like side poses, when we went from warrior, maybe one thing I could have added in would have been a wild thing, right? And then have them step back into a warrior and then move through the set. So there's like a lot of ways that if you have a focus, you can work it in throughout. And then at the end of the class, maybe that's where you're like, okay, we are really warm in our back bodies right now because we've added in back bends throughout every course, throughout every set. So now maybe that feels more accessible or interesting to you to experiment with. And that's like in my own practice, like how I'll function it. If I know like, oh my gosh, I've been so hunched over at a desk all week, I really want to work on back bends, then I still follow the same sequence, the same ranges of motion. It's just that every time I can, I'll ask, can I add a back bend to this shape? Low lunge. Can I add a back bend here? Oh yeah, I totally can. Maybe I want to get into twists, like low lunge. Can I add a twist here? Oh, yeah, definitely can. Right. And so I mentioned that here at the end, just because I think it's a really simple way to gear a practice toward a specific goal, but not necessarily be like, okay, if I want to work on wheel pose, like, do I just do a bunch of wheels? Like, no, just think about the ranges of motion that are involved in a wheel pose. Like, okay, opening up through the arms and opening the back, like strengthening through the back side of the body, opening through the front side of the body. That's really where you're going to get prepared to do the wheel pose later on. So guys, we are in our last 5 minutes, and I know we didn't pause for a Shavasana or anything, which of course is a hugely important part of a practice, but I want to make sure there is time for questions or comments. I just want to see how all of that landed with everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now and open up the floor for dialogue.